Hello and thanks for joining us. Coming up on today's show.
I see him as a supreme psychological novelist.
He's bringing these things that are very difficult in our own lives, and he's helping us make sense of them.
His writing spans a lot of different genres.
With nearly 20 books to his name, he's popular and literary at the same time. More than 2 decades after his bestseller Birdsong, in his new work, he returns to the subjects and themes which made that novel one of the most beloved in recent memory. Where My Heart Used to Beat is a moving tale of France, war, memory, love, and mental illness. Today's guest is Sebastian Faulks. Sebastian, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to have you. Now, many of your books are set in France. The best known are probably The Girl at the Lion Door, Birdsong and Charlotte Gray. You actually wrote part of Charlotte Gray while staying here in the south of France. You spent a year in Paris as a student. Much of this book, the new one, is set also in France.
Yeah.
What is so attractive about this country for you?
I suppose originally what was attractive about it was that it was not England. When I first tried to write books in my 20s, I found most of the novels that I read, which were being published in England by my contemporaries or people older than me, were very sort of narrow and parochial, and they're about the lives of the authors, really, thinly disguised. And I found it very difficult to get going. But then when I looked across the channel, after all, only 18 miles or whatever it is, here was a country so extraordinarily different from our own. It was such a gift. And every time I arrived in France, I'm talking now about the late 70s, early 80s, you could drive off the motorway down a main road and then into a small road. And all the villages and places, the little towns of northern France, seemed to me to suggest stories, ideas, the past, history, and all sorts of exciting things in a way that, quite frankly, Basingstoke didn't.
Well, 1993's Birdsong was about a soldier fighting in northern France in the First World War. It sold millions of copies. It was made into a play, then a film. Charlotte Gray is about a resistance fighter in the Second World War. That was made into a film with Cate Blanchett in 2002. What is it then about wartime France that keeps you coming back to that subject?
Well, I mean, the war thing really is just a function of my generation. And if you were brought up in the 1960s in Europe, it's likely that your parents, father, mother, would have been involved in the Second World War, and your grandfather in the First. It's just something that happened. It wasn't at all unusual. All the little boys and girls I was at school with, that's the way it was. The role of France is sort of particularly interesting in the 20th century because the First World War took place largely on French soil, and it took out a generation of French people. It traumatized the country from head to toe. And then, of course, the story of the Second World War, of occupied France, is a very, very different one, far less military, and it's a very complicated tale from a political and moral and behavioral point of view, the scar and trauma of which is still not over in Paris.
It's certainly not. While you've been here, you actually took part in a reading at the American Library in Paris, and we're going to have a listen to some of your fans now.
Okay.
He has a way of creating people and putting them in difficult circumstances, particularly those relating to war, that it makes one understand what and why people do the things that they do. To that extent, I see him as a supreme psychological novelist.
He has a way of dealing with these life issues, especially the death of his mother, that is so hard to put into words, but he manages to do it in a way that allows you to relive your own experience.
It's very accessible to everyone, and it's sort of, it spans a lot of different genres.
There you go, supreme psychological novelist. Your new book, actually, Where My Heart Used to Beat, is about an author and a psychiatrist. But really, it's about the 20th century, isn't it?
It is, really. It's the sort of culmination of a series of books I've been writing. The first few books I wrote, roughly speaking, including the French books you mentioned before, are about who are we, how did we get ourselves into this extraordinary mess. And the second group of books are really about what are we, why is the human animal so peculiar, so flawed, so violent and so odd. And the 20th century moved, and we're thinking about this a lot now with the centenary of the First World War. This is the centenary year of Verdun, the Battle of the Somme, and so on. It moved from a world of archdukes and kaisers and kings and so on in 1905 to, by the end of the century, a democracy, a social democracy in which men and women voted throughout But the cost of getting there was essentially genocide in Europe. And, you know, as far as all the continents of the world are concerned, Asia, the Americas, Australasia, and so on, Europe leads the world in genocide, and more recently and more fully than any other continent. And, you know, we need to sort of think a little bit about why this is. And is it something wrong with Europe? Is it something wrong with our politicians? Or is there some fault just in human beings? And that's, I mean, that's what the book is. That's the idea behind the book. But of course, it's actually the story of a man and a woman and friendship and love and so on.
Why don't you write then more about today's world, the 21st century, the conflicts now?
It's very difficult to get much of a sort of perspective on where we are. I have written contemporary books. I wrote a book called A Week in December, which was set in London at the time of the financial crash, and looked at a lot of questions, including the rise of radical Islam and the sort of corruption of the financial world in London. Most of those people should be in prison, and none of them went to prison. They just moved on to other jobs. And the book I'm researching at the moment in Paris will be set in the present day. There will also have a story enfolded within it, which will be set back during the occupation.
And what about a book set around the day in 2016 when Britain decided to leave the EU?
Yes, interesting. It falls just a couple of weeks before the centenary of the Battle of the Somme, actually, which is where I will be going. I don't think we will leave the European Union, as a matter of fact. I think most people in Britain are essentially lazy, and they'll stick with, prefer the devil they know to the devil they don't know. So I think it'll be close, but I think we'll stay.
Do you know which way you'll be voting?
I think I'll vote with the grown-ups, probably, as I did last time when we had a vote in the 70s in whether to stay in. But, of course, everyone has a little inner hooligan who responds to George Galloway and Nigel Farage and so on. The truth is, I think that Britain would be fine outside the European Union, but I think the European Union needs Britain badly, and I also believe that the European Union has, in some ill-defined way, helped to stop us killing one another and has a big peace-playing role to play.
OK, let's get back to the book, Where My Heart Used to Beat. A bit more basic. There's a lot of sex in the book.
Yes, there is rather a lot of sex in the book, isn't there?
Do you think when you're dealing with heavy subjects like war, I mean, maybe this is a bit simplistic, but you need to include a bit of sex to keep people going?
No, actually there was a lot more sex in it. I wrote the book over a long period and I stopped in the middle and wrote something else and came back to it, and I hadn't realised just how much there was. But it's not sort of sex there in order to titillate the reader. In fact, probably the most memorable part of it is when they don't have sex. He's sitting with a woman and they think they should, but actually neither of them can really be bothered. It does look, though, it's a book which is a lot about loneliness as well, the loneliness of the main character. He's only had one girlfriend, really, in all his life. That's his problem and his loss, and his contacts with other people are sad, standing in for what he's lost.
Mental illness is also one of your central themes, not just in this book, and notably in Human Traces, but here too. How would you describe your own mental state?
My own mental state today, a bit tired. But no, I'm reasonably sane, I think. Reasonably sane. I have sort of small neurotic things about not sleeping and travelling, and I'm rather frightened of flying in aeroplanes. But essentially, I'm 100% sane. OK,
I'd like to talk about James Bond. I know it was a little while ago. In 2006, the family of the late Ian Fleming asked you to write a James Bond book to mark the centenary of Fleming's birth. It was called Devil May Care. It was published in 2008. It became a bestseller. Would you like it to be made into a film? Do you think it will be? I would love it to be made into a film, but I don't think it will be. It's set in the 60s. It was my idea behind the book is that this is the novel that Ian Fleming would have written had he not died and had he retained his interest in the Bond story, in the Bond character. But it's set, the adventure takes place largely in Iran and Russia, so I was careful to include countries which, while they were interesting in the 60s, are still pretty potent today. But I think it is seen as a creation of the Fleming family and the Broccoli family, who run the film side. They're independent entities, and they have an interesting relationship, and I would love it to be made a film. It's very filmic, it's very visual, but I don't think it's going to happen. Oddly enough, it's old. It did well in France. You can never tell what's going to do well in France, because we know that the French people have a problem with the United States. They really don't like America at all. The best-selling book I've had, though, in France was set in America, called On Green Dolphin Street. They also like the James Bond book, which is very Anglo-Saxon. But my latest book, Where My Heart Used to Beat, it doesn't have a French publisher as yet. I don't know why, but maybe
Maybe it's too European. Who knows? That's one of the wonderful things about France and Paris is that French people's opinions are they're so perverse that you can never quite catch up with them.
I can identify with that. Now, there is a lot of chat about the next James Bond, Idris Elba, Tom Hiddleston. Who would you like to play yours if it was made into a film?
Oh, boy. Well, I'd like a young Sean Connery. I think he was by far and away the best of those actors. And I suppose that's because I grew up with him as a child. But, of course, his accent was wrong. I mean, James Bond didn't, speak like this with a Scottish.
It's very good.
Thank you. But I'd just seen Tom Hiddleston on television in the John le Carré thing, and he's very, very good. And he's a little bit tougher than you think, because he didn't really seem tough enough. But maybe he could do it well. Idris Elba, also good actor, good choice.
We're coming to the end of the show. You're a very visual writer. Are you influenced at all by painting, photography, cinema?
A lot. I mean, French painting had a huge influence on me, the 19th century paintings particularly. They were behind my whole idea of France, more than the books. And recently in London, there was a show by Anselm Kiefer, the great German artist, which I think there's a variation of that show, which I'm going to go and see in the Bilbourg shortly. I mean, and the way that he has used pictures, installations, sculptures, he is basically trying to reimagine the whole of German history in a different way. And that's a fantastically ambitious and impressive thing to do.
Okay, Sebastian Faulks, thank you so much for joining us here
Thank
on
you.
France 24. A reminder, your new book is called Where My Heart Used to Be. We're going to leave you with Anselm Kiefer's exhibition at the Pompidou Centre in Paris. Remember our website, we're also on Twitter and Facebook. There's more news coming up on France 24 after this.